Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode... something. This is episode 269. I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Trainman. Yeah, I know this is late. Don't complain, please. I have had a busy weekend, busy week following the trip, which the podcast is coming soon as well. Talk about that in the video. This is a little bit shorter than it usually is. The footage is shorter than it usually is because I was having some issues following SP3. Not SP3 related necessarily, but performance related issues in particular. Anyway, today we're going to talk about 1522. I need to pull up the video this is from. So this was a question asked on episode 221. Zombie Train 221. That's not a 1. 221. And I talked about decapods that episode, but now we're talking about did you oozes Frisco 1522 at all? He says. Yeah. So I did already talk about that museum, the museum that it's in, which is the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis. And well, it's near St. Louis, but whatever. It's close enough. It was a pain in the butt to get stuff out of that museum. I've talked about this before. And there were other issues with the engines in that museum. And there was also an issue regarding the stuff in the museum, which we had assumed that people had come and taken stuff out of the museum, like machinery, before we got there. We never really got, and I wish there was a cut and dry answer to this. We got sort of a yes, like sort of a like, okay, we think this was from there, so we have to assume that yeah, I guess people did go in there and steal things and move them around, but it was really a question of what were they doing with them and what were they even taking. You know, it was again some locomotive maintenance machinery, you know, lathes, and I think even parts for a crane and you know, that sort of thing. Flangers for tube sheets and all sorts of equipment that's used to work on these engines. And that range from anything from like tools, again, you know, some devices like that, to you know, full large pieces of machinery that you'd see at a locomotive shop. And again, we would keep finding random pieces turned up, or we'd hear about them, and I don't know, it was very curious. It was very curious and kind of bizarre. But we're here to talk about 1522 itself. 1522. When we got to 1522, now 1522 was taken out of service about 10 years before the Great Panic, and it was basically retired. You know, it wasn't planned to be restored again. It was sitting on display. It still had some life left in it, though. You know, we saw that the engine wasn't completely decommissioned. It wasn't just set to be on display forever. It was put up in such a way that if it needed to be restored, it could be. But at this point in time, we were looking for engines that were in operating condition. And we were out in this area, and we sort of thought, well, what can we get more mileage out of this engine? It's done its time, sure, but it's excuse me. It's done its time, but does it have a little bit more life left in it that we can actually use it, you know, before we need to actually submit it for a rebuild? You know, basically, can we use this locomotive right here as a stopgap for the time being before we work up some other locomotives? And the answer was yes. So that was nice. For once we got, you know, what we ordered. Basically, we put it into service with with minimal effort after getting it out of the museum, which was a lot more than minimal effort. We got out of the museum. We sent it off to, I think, not the Steamtown area, because we didn't have that area totally secure, but we sent it much farther east. And we had it going between the East Coast and the Midwest. A little bit. So we rapidly found that it had problems in infested areas because people that are familiar with this engine, which I was not one of at the time, people that are familiar with this engine will know that it is an obnoxiously loud locomotive. It is just impressively, stupidly loud, and it was more of a pain because it would just keep attracting attention. The other issue with the engine, which this was some of the other effort we put in effort to get it out of the building, we put an effort to get it running, although all things considered, it wasn't that much effort, but most of that was devoted to getting it to fire on coal. And that involved changing the grates, getting rid of the burners, sort of, I believe, changing around the way the fire door was. This was one of the larger conversions that we did, and it was one of the earlier conversions that we did. And this was an engine that I don't recall if it was ever set up for coal, but it was pretty well set up for oil when we got our hands on it. So it was like, it was very much an oil burner, and we had to do some changes. We had to make some changes. Now, our changes were not completely thorough, and that's why very shortly into World War Z, very shortly into the Zombie Train Incorporated, I should say, we had to pull the engine out of service for a rebuild. We sent it over to Strasbourg, which was one of our better shops, and still is. It sort of maintains its position. And they pretty much pulled the thing apart as much as they needed to give it a full inspection. They did some patching. I don't remember all of what needed to happen, but there was a lot of work that got done, again, mainly on the firebox, because the firebox and its fixings were not designed for a coal burner. So they had to do a lot of cleaning. They had to do a lot of, they had to do some patching up, I believe, and they also had to do some real work on the grates, like to make them actually work the way they should work in a coal-burning engine instead of making it so that they could work. There's a subtle but important difference between something working and something working well, and the grates in 1522 did not work all that well, and really just sort of exacerbated the problems that the locomotive would have, because it was a very, very loud engine, and due to our rather hasty changes, ended up being not a very good steamer. So you'd oftentimes, and this is, the stuff that I heard from the crews, I didn't spend a lot of time around 1522. Compared to other engines in the Zombie Train Incorporated, I did spend more time around it, but that's because early on, that was the engine that we had, basically. It was one of the few that we had and could get running easily. So it was in, group 1.5 of engines. Because there were the first group of engines that were the ones that were runnable, that we could just take and run. Then there were the next group of engines which required minimal effort to run, to get running. And then there were the real second group of engines, which were the engines that needed to have their rebuilds complete, or needed to have relatively quick rebuilds done. So, yeah, this was in group 1.5 of engines. And then it was taken out of service to see if we could solve the noise problem too. I sort of set people on that, and I think they improved it a little bit, but not really that much. It just has to do with the way the engine is designed and the way that it drafts and everything. But yeah, when that engine works hard, that engine gets loud. And so we had to we basically took 1522 and sent it west when we had the opportunity. Once we had the engine rebuilt so that it would run properly, and we had enough locomotives on the East Coast, or, in Appalachia, in the Midwest, 1522 went west. 1522 survived mostly on the coast, and then slowly came east as the Army took over more area. It had a pretty storied history within the Zombie Train Incorporated, such that it was very, very well used after its rebuild for medium-duty stuff in the mountains, mostly. That means shorter trains involving passengers and high-priority freight, or longer trains involving low-priority freight. Nothing that needed to get to a battlefield in the nick of time, necessarily, although 1522 was sometimes used in the instance where we did need to move a medium amount of troops. Not a few carloads worth, but not a 20 or 25 car train. So these engines, or that engine in particular, really got, it got its worth. We got our effort's worth out of it, I guess, because money's worth wouldn't really make sense there. And it was I can't, again, after the rebuild, I can't complain about the engine's performance. And everything I heard about it was really good. They excelled in the roles that they were given, and sometimes they even did some less exciting stuff, I guess. But it was usually shuttling stuff behind the front lines, or, if necessary, to the front lines. Now, they wouldn't usually run the engine to the front lines unless there was already some active fighting, or they were already finished preparing, because the train was a dinner bell for the zombies, but it was also sort of a begin the fighting sort of gong. There's so much that I can talk about with regards to that engine, because boy, is it really something else. Oh crap, did I might have made a quasi-major production error over here. Yeah, I definitely did. Oh well, I'm gonna need to fix that. But, yeah, 1522 got a lot of use. It got a lot of love from crews and from people that it helped. I think it was involved during the encirclement of Denver that I talked about, at least to some extent, if not on the front lines and behind the scenes, because, yeah, that would have been one of the engines that was available to do that and would have been sort of nimble enough. The issue is, with a lot of the Western engines, we were dealing with a lot of large engines, a lot of Northerns, and sometimes above, as in Malays. And 1522 being a mountain type, and being relatively light-footed compared to some of the larger Northerns, could go some places where we wouldn't send Northerns, and the disadvantage of it being a dinner bell made itself an advantage in the fact that if we sent it into an area where we expected to get people's attention, we didn't need to be laying on the whistle. People could hear it anyway. So that was something kind of inadvertent and special that came out of 1522. It's like everything cycles around the fact that the engine was loud. And it really speaks to the fact that it is really loud. The fact that that was what we continually focused on. So, anyway. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Feel free to put your questions down below. I'm going to try to return to the normal schedule after this, and I'll see you next week. Trainman out.